Medita and Dobar den. Greetings to all my friends and colleagues in Kosovo. It's good to be with you again, even if it's only virtually. My talk today, if we can see the first slide, is about developing self-reliant, lifelong learners. Now, I want to talk about the 4 different activities that we've been discussing in the pre-conference sessions, because these 4 activities are designed to assist students to become self-reliant, lifelong learners. In other words, to develop the skills and competencies they're going to need for 20th century life and work. Project-based learning, assessment for learning, school community business links, and the integration of educational technology. Why, looking at my second slide, why is there a need for self-reliant lifelong learning in the 21st century? Well, the answer to that is the constant exponential change that's going on at the present time and will happen even more in the future. Technological change, it's difficult to keep up with the rate of change. Many teachers in Kosovo have had to do that in the past few months. Climate change, social change, and of course globalization, which has meant that the life and work is changing constantly in the 21st century. On my next slide, you may be puzzled why I have a photograph of a photographer taking a photograph at a football match. Well, this last year was my idea of what Zoom meant. Zoom meant looking more closely at something through a camera or a microscope. And now, of course, Zoom has a new meaning to me. This is a great example of how changes come about unexpectedly. COVID-19 has led to a greater need for online learning and communication. So Zoom now has a completely new meaning. The next slide shows a very good example of how schools in the project, partner schools, are looking at the changes that are happening and responding in a very positive way. This online project by a partner school was about COVID-19 and how it's affecting the Kosovo economy. And it's a great example of how to respond in a positive way to challenges that are going to face our young people this century. The program supports the Kosovo curriculum, and this slide shows how the Kosovo curriculum aligns with international standards for education, including particularly EU education strategy. These emphasize the need for self-reliant, lifelong learners and set out key competencies also for lifelong learning. In my next slide, I say, what do we mean by self-reliant lifelong learners? If you read the literature about these things, you'll find that there are other words used. Autonomous is used, meaning self-reliant or an independent learner. One of the people who first tried to identify what we mean by independent learning, because it meant many things to many people, said it's the ability to take charge of one's learning, to be responsible for one's learning. So self-reliant long-term learners are able to make informed choices and take responsibility for their own learning. They're motivated to learn and confident enough to take decisions and act on them. And they understand the value of reflecting on their learning and deciding whether it has been effective or whether they need to try another approach. My next slide shows that independent learning does not mean working on one's own. When we say independent, it doesn't mean one person working on their own and learning on their own in a library or at a computer. Independent learners will discuss their learning with others. They may share a problem, for example, with other students. explaining a problem to somebody else can help to clarify your thinking and clarify issues. Explaining a concept to someone without a shared background knowledge is a very good way of making sure you understand the full implications of the concept. When I was a teacher, I found that getting the older children to try and explain some concepts to younger children was a very good way of reinforcing their own knowledge. And most importantly, independent learning doesn't mean working without a teacher. Independent learners will seek expertise from anybody who has knowledge, including teachers, professionals, and experts from the community. This could be face-to-face, or it could be online. And teachers still need to guide students through the curriculum. They have to scaffold the information and arrange experiences which will motivate and inspire learners. Now, this next slide shows a diagram which I've taken from the literature, which tries to show the 6 dimensions, the 6 aspects of the autonomous learner. The personal and interpersonal dimension, the skills you need to learn, technology competencies, career aims, to know where you're going, to know what your aims are and why you're learning, organizational skills like note-taking and organizing your knowledge, and productivity, working hard, working carefully, and so on. All these are aspects of individual development within the autonomous or the self-reliant learner. Let's look at these one at a time. Learning skills, well, these are learned through the activities that we are promoting on the project, in particular project-based learning. This helps students develop critical thinking skills, develop problem-solving skills, and most importantly, how to research, how to find out what it is that they need to find out. The use of educational technology, this is something addressed very seriously by the project, not just in terms of using computers, but using all sorts of educational technology, which you would find in the workplace also. On my next slide, career education is a key part of what the project is doing and helping the ministry strengthen its career education. This gives not only knowledge about future careers and gives and motivates students, but it also gives entrepreneurial skills, because it's not just finding a job, but maybe finding a business that is important to students in the future. The next slide talks about how these activities that the project are organizing help the organizational skills that learners need. Project-based learning, all the time they're learning these organizational skills, and work experience activities are very important because they see how professionals organize themselves and organize their day and organize their work and their projects. So they're picking up, again, more entrepreneurial skills. The next slide, we look at productivity. In particular, looking at work experience, learning from professionals, learning from businesses, and also through project-based learning, students realize the importance of perseverance, of conscientiousness, not being late for work or late for school, and creativity, because this is what will be productive in the end. This is what will produce wealth, creativity. Finally, the last dimension, the personal dimension, the interpersonal dimension. This is all through project-based learning and also through assessment for learning, through their self-evaluation that students will do in assessment for learning. They get to understand themselves and their learning. They will also learn emotional intelligence by working in teams on projects, knowing that they can't have their own way all the time, that other people maybe have good ideas, and they will learn communication skills so that they communicate well with their colleagues and their friends inside and outside the school. Now, the next slide is a little bit longer. I hope you can all read this. Although our project is called an after-school support for teens project, many of the activities, of course, take place in school time. So it might be better to talk about non-formal and informal learning rather than after-school learning. Many of the activities take place in school time, but they're different from the normal class or school setting. And that's why they're powerful, because they stress the practical value of learning. These non-formal and informal settings can unlock students' creative interests and potential, enabling them to make links between the formal curriculum and real life. And this can empower them to become the drivers of their own learning and make their learning more meaningful and enjoyable. In addition, students that can integrate informal learning experiences, their own interests, into their formal learning would be more motivated. If they use 21st century skills, such as learning to learn and collaborating with others in school, they will again use these new skills in informal settings outside of school, as well as in the future. Now, my next slide goes back to normal traditional teaching. This project has never said that we do away with all traditional teaching. The teaching of knowledge is very, very important. And sometimes there's a need for a lecture and students need to listen. But even in these traditional classroom settings, teachers can help students become self-reliant learners through assessment for learning. Because assessment for learning includes setting targets, obtaining and providing instant feedback, self-assessment, and peer assessment. Assessment for learning encourages students to be participants in their assessment instead of just being the object of the assessment. They learn to analyze their own performance, identify gaps in their learning, and to plan for improvement. And these are all very valuable lifelong skills. 3 quotes here I've taken from the literature about assessment for learning, because this is not just something the project is emphasizing, it's something that is being emphasized internationally. Formative assessment that engenders or brings about learning, often with an emphasis on feedback. That's one definition of formative assessment or assessment for learning, which is the two things are often used synonymously. Another quote I like is that when you use the word assessment, normally people think about tests and exams, but really assessment for learning is all about better teaching. And that's why, for example, asking good questions, asking questions that require a lot of thought are an important part of assessment for learning. And finally, if we want our students to become effective lifelong learners, then they have to be able to assess their own learning themselves and know what their needs are, what kind of training they may need next, and so on. These all develop what are sometimes called meta skills. These include the ability to make informed judgment about their learning and performance levels and that of their peers. So they should know if they're behind their peers or ahead of their peers. Maybe they can learn from their peers, or they can help their peers with their learning. Metacognitive skills, or self-awareness, self-regulation, and their application are also very important. Meta work skills, higher order evaluation skills that they need to identify and capitalize on learning opportunities throughout their careers. These would all be built into lifelong learners. So what we should be using in our lessons are assessment activities that explicitly endorse and involve critical reflection, self-critique, and evaluation. They all form a key part in the development of these meta skills. In self and peer assessment, the focus shifts from students wanting just to please the teacher to fostering a sense of responsibility for their own learning. Students also gain confidence in their ability to apply their learning in contexts outside the school, for example, through work experience or community youth mapping, two activities that the project has been supporting. Here are a few examples of the kind of assessment practices, kind of activities that can be carried out by teachers. And I've taken them from my own experience, I've taken them from Kosovo, I've taken them from international experiences. These are all things that can be observed and checked, and often are products that the teacher can use to assess. First of all, students writing guidelines for a lay audience. So instead of writing it for the teacher, imagine writing it, for example, to explain something for their parents. This will make sure they're using direct words, direct vocabulary that can be understood by everybody to make sure that they understand it themselves. Students can write business plans. Students can write abstracts and peer reviews by forming editorial panels and critiquing each other's work. History students, for example, could write a children's book for young children about historical events. Again, so they clarify their own understanding. When they go on a field visit, for example, to a business, instead of writing a report for the teacher, let them write a report for the business, so and with suggestions and ideas for the business, as well as academic ideas. They can present oral presentations of their lab work, for example, using PowerPoint. They can research and present breakthroughs in science through using activities like plays or poems or making films, just to recount what actually happened. All this will raise their interest and make sure they do their research more carefully. They can pitch entrepreneurial ideas to each other and designs that they've created, or they can also present these to a panel of business representatives or members of the community. And finally, instead of just writing a report, a textual report, they can make technical posters and showcase them to a lay audience. So all these ideas mean that there will be products that the teachers can assess, and the students can assess, and their peers can assess. This is my final slide. My view is that if the activities discussed in this conference, the 4 activities, can be established into the everyday practice of schools, then Kosovo can develop a generation of young people ready to face the challenges of the 21st century. I congratulate the schools who have agreed to partner with our programme and wish them great success in implementing change and reform. Thank you.